Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Quarantine History. Um, the next set of videos we are going to be looking at Chapter 16, which deals with the Vietnam War. Chapter 16 actually has 5 sections. However, the last section doesn't really deal with the Vietnam War, so we're going to be doing sections 1 and 2 this week, and then the following week I'll do sections 3 and 4. As you can see from the title, Section 1 deals with the origins of the Vietnam War. So before we get into any actually fighting by the United States, we have to look at basically how we got to that point, and that's what this section deals with. So, first off, the area we're going to be talking about. The area we're going to talk about is basically in this map. And in the 1800s, it was known as Indochina. It was mainly ruled by the French, and the countries we're talking about are present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. You can see China is right here. Korea is not too far away. And the French are going to own this area, control this area for most of the 1800s and early 1900s. The French are going to be very strict with their ruling, and basically only French-connected people had a decent life under the French rule. That allowed this man, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh wanted independence for Indochina, specifically Vietnam. He wanted his people, the Vietnamese, to be free. And so in 1912, Ho Chi Minh will actually leave Vietnam and basically go all around the world looking for help. He goes to America, he goes to England, but basically no one will help him. The only ones that will help him are basically communist-connected nations. And as a result, Ho Chi Minh will become a communist. And as a result, he will get help eventually later on from communist nations. Fast forward to World War II. If you remember from World War II in the 1930s, Japan will basically take over the Pacific. And one of the places they take over are Indochina. However, after World War II, with the defeat of the Japanese, the French want Indochina back. The problem is World War II was just fought to free people of rule of another country. We kicked the Japanese out of places, we kicked the Germans, the Italians out of places. And here we're simply going to exchange the Japanese for the French. And a lot of people around the world said, imperialism is dead. We can't really have countries controlling other countries. But the French wanted their territory back. And so the United States and President Truman are left with a decision. Do they help the French retake Indochina, or do they support independence for places like Vietnam? Truman and the United States will choose to help the French. They thought having the French as an ally was more important than independence for Vietnam. One of the main reasons was the United States was fearful if anything happened with the Soviet Union, especially in Europe, the French would side with the Soviets and not the United States. So this is one of the reasons the United States decided to help them retake Indochina. So for the next decade, the French are going to be in Indochina trying to reassert control. Meanwhile, a new U.S. president comes in 1953. His name is Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower believed that the United States, their job was to stop the spread of communism. We've talked about this, the Domino Theory. And if you can watch this video here on the Domino Theory. But Eisenhower and the United States believed if you let one place fall to communism, then other places are going to fall. This is why the United States got involved in Korea in 1950 under Truman. This domino theory was if you let one place fall, everything else is going to fall. If you look at the picture, you can see the dominoes are labeled and pictured with various countries in that area. And if you look all the way at the end of these dominoes, you have Canada and the United States. People in the government believed that yes, if you let places like Vietnam and Laos and the Philippines fall to communism, it'll eventually come to the United States. The French are not going to be successful in retaking Indochina. The Vietnamese and the Cambodians and the Laotians, they were not going to let it happen. And the French ultimately give up. In 1954, the French will lose at a battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And this loss basically assured the French that they were going to leave Indochina. And this was a big, big deal. You had a former Allied power, the French, losing to, in essence, at the time, a third world country or a third world area. And so for the French to leave was a big shock to everyone in the world. And in 1954, the French signed what was called the Geneva Accords. The Geneva Accords had three major pieces. Part one, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia would be free. They would no longer be known as Indochina. They would be known as their country names. However, Vietnam would be split into half. The United States felt you can't have all these places just all of a sudden be free and fall to communism, because Ho Chi Minh was there in Vietnam, and they believed that, rightfully so, that Vietnam would become communist. So Vietnam itself was split into half. North would be communist, South would be non-communist. But in 1956, there would be unification elections in both parts. Do you want to be communist? Do you want to be democratic? So that's going to happen in 1956. Now, the United States will put in this man into power in South Vietnam. His name is Ngo Dien Diem, and Diem is pictured here. Diem was put into place because he was someone that the United States could basically manipulate, be a puppet. But Diem was not popular. For example, throughout his tenure, Diem will do things that anger a majority of the population in South Vietnam. For example, South Vietnam at the time was about 90 to 95% Buddhist, and the rest was Catholic. Diem was a Catholic, but he would pass laws that were anti-Buddhist. So if you're doing something that angers 90% of the country, you're not going to be very popular, and that's going to be an issue for him and obviously for the United States. So in 1956, when it comes time for those reunification elections, the United States tells Diem, do not participate. If you participate, you will lose. And we don't want that to happen, so you're not doing it. So Diem, listening to the United States, tells his people, we're not participating in these elections, and Vietnam will continue to be split. This angered people in South Vietnam. They wanted to be unified. And so as a result, this group is created in 1957. They are called the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, and they were South Vietnamese communists. So once the United States begins fighting in Vietnam, they're fighting in essence a two-front war. They're going to be fighting North Vietnam, but they're also fighting this group, the Viet Cong, and they were located in the South. So the United States is fighting the North and half of the people of South Vietnam. So we'll get into more of that in section 2. A new president comes in. We know Kennedy comes in after Eisenhower. Kennedy believed that the United States should train South Vietnam. They were not prepared to fight any battle on their own, so the United States needed to help them prepare. So Kennedy in 1961 will begin to send troops to South Vietnam, and the goal of these troops was to strictly advise. They are there to train, they are there to help, they are not to get involved in the fighting. Well, it happened. If you're in a group that's getting shot at, you can't simply step aside and say, I'm an American, you can't shoot me. That's not how war works. And so eventually the United States is getting more and more involved in this conflict. However, by 1963, the United States is growing tired of Diem because of his actions, such as passing anti-Buddhist laws. And in November of 1963, President Kennedy tells the CIA to go ahead with a plan to get rid of Diem. The plan was for the military to overthrow or initiate a coup and remove Diem from power. However, during the incident, Diem is murdered. Kennedy was incensed with the CIA. He's already angry with the CIA because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco 2 years earlier, and now a ally of theirs is killed. And so he believes the CIA is not being upfront with him, out to get him, so forth and so on. Ironically, or not ironically, however your conspiracy theories go, 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself is murdered, which will bring a fourth president into power during this time. His name is Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson will be in power for less than a year when the incident that basically starts U.S. military involvement in Vietnam occurs. And that incident is here. On August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnam will quote-unquote shoot at U.S. ships. One was the USS Maddox, the other was the USS Turner Joy. Neither was hit. However, when they looked into the incident, it wasn't the North Vietnamese firing. It was the Americans firing at themselves because of bad weather. And so the Gulf of Tonkin incident was used by the American government to basically create a reason to protect themselves. Because of this incident, President Johnson will order an airstrike against North Vietnam. U.S. airplanes will fly over and bomb targets. He will also go to Congress and ask for a resolution. That becomes known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution here. And what the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution did is it basically allowed the President of the United States to protect the United States any way he seemed important, vital. As a result, Congress basically gave up their power to declare war. Johnson was able to fight a war without technically declaring war. So some people like to argue over what to call Vietnam. Should it be the Vietnam War or the Vietnam conflict? Because technically, we did not declare war on North Vietnam. Johnson and then later Richard Nixon will fight this war basically through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And it was known as the blank check because basically Congress said, here's a check, whatever you need, do. And that's obviously not probably the best way to fight a war. Either way, 1964 is the beginning of major U.S. involvement in this area known as Vietnam, which will lead to the Vietnam War and U.S. involvement for the next 10 years. So Section 2, I will get into the beginning of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Until then, I'll see you guys later. Be good.